Welcome to Scale Model Workshop. This video is a supplement to the A-20 construction series, and it covers what I did to enhance the twin .30 caliber machine guns supplied in the kit. I split it off from the main series because I think it's an illustration of a few interesting concepts. And for those that are interested, I wanted to provide a complete explanation of the process, but a detailed explanation would have made episode 1 overly long, and I didn't want it to get lost in the middle of everything else. My initial impressions of the kit gun were that they just looked like a square hunk of plastic with a couple of barrels sticking out, and my first inclination was to see if there was something better available. Here's my comparison of some of the other kit-supplied renditions. At first I thought the Great Wall Hobbies might work out pretty well if I just replaced the horribly oversized barrels. But the shape and details are just soft with a generally pebbly surface that results from their mold cutting process. The underlying mount's far too bulky with very poor locating devices that make for a recipe of misalignment. With nothing really standing out as a big improvement, and reminding myself of my original plan to stick with as much of the kit as possible, I went back and took a look at the AMT rendition, and here's what I came up with. The overall width to the outside of the receivers was just about spot on. The length of the receivers was pretty good, along with a bit of interesting detail at the rear. But one of the major advantages was that the entire structure was square and reasonably sharp, which gave me a lot to work with, especially with the shield molded in the proper position. I started by carving out the space between the guns and removing the sight. Next, I wanted to give myself something better to hold on to, but being careful to maintain the overall square relationships. The gun barrels were cut off and the face of the shield was milled flat. A piece of acrylic was cemented to the shield. I used the mill to do the initial narrowing of the receivers, but the finish work was done with a file. There needs to be some space between the receivers and the link ejection chute. I started by cementing in a piece of styrene strip to each receiver. The excess strip material was trimmed away, and the assembly was mounted back in the mill to establish the width for the ejection chute and remove the majority of the molded ammo boxes. Material was milled away from the bottom of the receivers to establish the correct height and remove the molded representation of the bearer bars. Here you can see the results of removing the unwanted molded portions, while still maintaining the squareness. It's important to keep in mind how small this thing really is, because milling styrene isn't as clean and sharp as brass, and one errant pass with a blade or file can ruin things pretty fast. In order to keep the ammo boxes in alignment, I milled them in one piece and then cemented them in place using a spacer and the acrylic base. Once the cement was set, I milled them to their final height and width. The link ejection chute was just a simple turning. The assembly was removed from the acrylic base and Master Detail's perforated gun barrels were installed. These barrels are extremely fine, and if you've never worked with them before, here are a few suggestions. The instructions tell you to drill a 0.5 mm hole and then cement the barrels in place with cyanoacrylate. I found that if you take care in drilling an accurate 0.5 mm hole, the barrels will fit securely in place without any glue. Second, be aware that the brass is extremely soft and the barrels bend and scratch easily. So if your holes are a bit off and you need to adjust the alignment, do it with a straight edge at the base of the barrel. If you try and do it with your fingers, you're more than likely just going to put a curve in the barrel. Soft jaw pliers or tape wrapped around tweezers are a good insurance against scratches. The frame was assembled from 16/1000 wire and brass machinings. I created a simple jig to hold the wire and support the crossbars while soldering. The important element to note here is that the center section was milled out so as not to create a heat sink, yet there's enough material on either side to support the crossbar. In a nutshell, the machine process went like this. I started with a piece of brass stock mounted in the mill. 4 16/1000 holes were drilled. The 3 bars were cut off with a fine saw. The center section was milled out, The front face was milled off to expose the holes, and finally the jig was sectioned off. All the pieces are clamped to solder up the first bar. This is the final frame cemented in place. The shield was milled from solid stock. I added the base of the ejector chute and used a little 8/1000 wire to simulate the charging rods and handles, finally giving everything a quick coat of black lacquer primer. While far from perfect, I think these modifications have gone a ways towards making the guns look more prototypical, and it gives the entire assembly the appearance that it's made up of separate pieces rather than just one molded piece. If I had started from scratch and fabricated everything from brass, it probably would have been a lot easier and I could have incorporated some finer detail. But the fact that the original could be modified with a fair amount of styrene and done in a way to keep things as square and sharp as possible goes a long way towards adding credibility to the finished piece. If you're interested in what prototypical information that I was working from, check out my webpage on the A-20 project and the PDF I assembled for the gunner's compartment. I have links to both in the description below. One final note. I found that some of the small details in my Italeri re-release boxings didn't fare so well, and you might find that you'd have to do a little more prep work than you would otherwise with an AMT molding. I hope you found this video interesting, and so long for now, and I'll see you next time.